I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not speaking meaningfully about anything, okay? Because I don't know what the words I'm using are referencing.
Like all things, whatever happens in the world ought to happen, right, within God's ultimate plan,
Okay, but
right?
tell me again, what are the actions in which you think, from God's perspective, shouldn't occur at all, right?
Things that are not
Categorically,
happening.
things that are not happening, right? But
Yeah.
things that are not happening don't have any moral connotation there, right? You're just telling me
We're not
that
talking
this
about
state
moral
of affairs
connotations.
isn't,
But that's just
right?
to say that like
That's
evil
irrelevant.
doesn't occur.
We're not talking about moral connotations when we're talking about the ultimate decretive will of God.
The ultimate decree, yeah, but the ultimate decretive will of God, you understand, is conditionalized to what his plan is, as you just admitted, which is just the instrumental ought, right? What I'm asking is, what is the categorical ought in which indicates that there's certain things that shouldn't occur under any context? Not that they don't occur, that they shouldn't occur under any context. And you just saying that those things don't happen is a descriptive statement, not a normative one, right?
Yeah, we're not talking about things that ought not to happen in any circumstance,
Yeah,
because there are things that God allows in
that's
certain circumstances and things that
because
God
my
allows in other
argument is
circumstances.
related to these pro tanto evils, right? Which is just to say these types of evils that shouldn't occur under any context, right? And if they shouldn't occur under any context, then under no context are those things morally permissible by definition.
When we're talking about moral evil, we're not talking about things that should not happen under any context.
Yeah,
That's not what we're talking
those
about.
types of evils, I take it, that have a normative connotation there. So you're just saying that those things don't occur. That's just a descriptive state of affairs. That's not a
You
normative.
didn't understand what I said. You didn't understand what I said.
Well,
When we're
then you're
talking about
not
moral
addressing my
evils,
critique.
when we're
You're
talking
not
about
addressing
moral
my critique.
evils, when we're talking about
Yeah, I don't give
moral
a shit
evils,
about what you're
Let's
talking
say
when we're
what
about.
J
talking
Are you
Rock is
about
gonna
going? Are
moral
say.
you going to
Stop,
evils,
stop.
address
when
my
we're talking
argument?
about moral evils,
Let's say what he's.
when we're talking about moral evils, we're not talking about things that happen. Or sorry, when we're talking about moral, yeah, we're not talking about things that ought not happen under any circumstance, under any context. That's not what we're talking about when we say moral evils. Moral evils are specific to a specific context, and that would be the prescriptive will of God, right?
Well,
We're not
no,
talking
that's
about things that ought
actually
not happen
incorrect,
in any
right?
context.
Because moral evils can actually refer to pro tanto things that are evil, right? Do you think that
That's not what we're talking about.
do you think that the term moral evil is just context specific, right?
And the
Always.
Christian worldview is specific to God's prescriptive will. Yeah.
Oh, so then I mean, it's hard to say. It's hard to see then how you're a moral realist and you believe in categorical oughts. Then, if they're just instrumentalized to God's desire.
Yeah, we're not talking about when I talk about moral evils, we're not talking about things that ought not happen under any context or any circumstance.
Yeah, and I'm saying,
So what's the
but look,
contradiction?
the contradiction is that there's certain things, right, that are pro tanto evil that shouldn't occur, in which case, if they shouldn't occur, they're going to be morally impermissible. But you're saying that God morally permits those things to occur. That's a contradiction.
Yeah, we're not talking. So again, um, there is nothing that is completely impermissible, right? That we're talking about God allowing them, right? So for example, um, it is permitted that people break God's moral decrees. It's permitted. God allows it. It's obviously true. There's no Christian who doesn't hold that to be true.
But if
So
it's
the contradiction,
permissible, then it's just not the case
the
that it ought
contradiction,
not to occur.
the contradiction. Let me finish. The contradiction wouldn't stand against the position that I
But see,
or
if God morally
a great many,
permits
if not
those
most, of the
things,
Christian
sorry, but you see, if
hold to.
God morally permits those things, how are you going to say in the same context that those things shouldn't occur? Right? That just
God
denotes
permits them
another
with
context.
respect. No, they ought not occur with respect to God's moral law, and that's what we're held morally accountable for.
Yeah, but but the moral law informs you that those actions are morally impermissible. If they're morally impermissible, then it's the case that they shouldn't be done. You would agree with that, correct?
Yeah, with respect to God's permissive will. Yeah.
Okay, but when you say God's permissive will, are you saying that God morally permits those things to
Sorry,
occur,
not
or is
permissive, prescriptive. I'm a
Okay,
prescriptive will.
so now you're fumbling around the wills, right? So what
No,
is
I just
his
misspoke. I
what
didn't
is his
because we're
prescript
talking
does
about
his
permissive.
prescriptive
Yeah,
does his prescriptive will inform that those things ought not to,
with respect to his prescriptive will. Yeah,
with respect to, yeah, but look, if you're saying that from his prescriptive will those things ought not to be done, right? What ought not to be done is just going to be morally impermissible, and what's morally impermissible should
you're just begging
not
the
be
question against my
morally
position.
permitted. Yeah, it
You
shouldn't
realize
be
that's what you're
morally
doing, right? You're just
permitted.
begging the question against my
That's
position
not
because
begging the
I don't. I'm
question.
not.
That's just
No, because
denoting what the
my
terms
position is
mean.
my
J.
position is
Robin,
not that
that's
things
just
ought
what the
not happen
terms mean.
and under any circumstance, right? That's not my position, and that's not the position of Christians because
That doesn't matter. It
obviously,
doesn't matter. Look, it
obviously,
doesn't even matter. It doesn't even
obviously,
matter. It doesn't
yes,
even
I'm speaking.
matter. If
But
it doesn't
let's
even
give J.
matter.
Robin a chance
I'm
to
It,
speaking.
explain.
Yeah. So
wait.
when we're talking about things, there's so listen. When we're talking about God's moral decrees, it's not the case, and it's not the position that they ought not happen under any circumstance because God lets them happen. God allows it to happen. The violations of them, I'll say. God allows violations of them to happen. So by impermissible, you're saying that there is no circumstance in which they are permitted, or they will be permitted, or they should be permitted within a certain context. Then that's just not true. It's not true that they shouldn't be permitted under any context,
They shouldn't be. Look, but
or shouldn't be.
you're still saying from your point of view that those things, analytically speaking, shouldn't occur. So it doesn't really matter, right? In that context, if it shouldn't occur, then the agent in question shouldn't morally permit it to occur, right? So it doesn't even matter what the context is. And I'm saying
Oh,
in
yes, it
that
does.
very context, right? There's not going to be a sufficient pro toto reason for God to allow it to occur in the first place. Do you know the
Oh, yes, there
difference
is.
between a pro tanto and a pro toto?
No, I don't know the difference between those two things.
Well,
But
there's
the
going
point
to
is that
be.
God says God has a reason to allow them to the fulfillment of His plan.
Okay, but but then if you're just saying if it's for the fulfillment of his plan, then it's not going to be the case that the things that he's morally permitting in that context shouldn't occur, right? Because they're conducive towards his ends.
Well, they should occur with so they should occur with respect to the like God's decretive will, but they shouldn't occur with respect to the permissive will, or not permissive, the prescriptive will.
Okay, but in his decretive will question, um, it's not the case that those things in question shouldn't occur, right? So he has all the reason to permit it to happen. And what you mean by permit here is that he morally permits them to occur, right? So what I'm not understanding is why you would call those things evil from the decretive will perspective.
God is moral in permitting them to occur. Okay, that doesn't make the actions themselves morally
Well,
right.
now you're just repeating the claim, right? The claim, the
No, it's just my
argument that I'm
position.
making is that if
You
he
have to present the
has a
argument.
pro toto, if he has a pro toto reason to morally permit those things to occur, then under that context, those things wouldn't be evil.
I don't see how that follows. How does it follow that they are
Because it's
that they
conducive.
therefore
Anything, anything that
let me finish the question. How does it follow that if something is bringing us closer to one sense of God's will, that therefore they ought to happen with respect to another
again,
sense
you're
of
just
God's will?
repeating a question. So here was where I answer. So premise one, anything that's conducive towards God's desires is something that from God's decretive will ought to occur. Premise two, I don't know, stabbing a baby to death is conducive towards God's ends, right? Conclusion, therefore, stabbing a baby is something from God's decretive will ought to occur. Now, do you disagree with that?
No, I don't disagree. It is conducive to God's decretive will. Yeah.
Okay, so then you admit that if God has a pro toto reason to allow those things to occur, right, then if what we mean by allow here is that he morally permits those things to occur, then under the And under this context, those things aren't evil.
Yeah, and if by evil you're talking about things that God allows to happen and things that God does not allow to happen, or sorry, if by evil you're saying things that God does not allow to happen, um, then yeah, nothing. There's nothing that happens that God does not allow to happen.
Right. So
That's not how we
you
use the word
agree
evil.
that if God morally permits the person to stab the baby to death, then under that context, right, and we're even applying your position here, those things ought
Yeah,
to occur, and therefore they
yeah, but
aren't
that's
evil.
not like that's I've you know, this is like the third or fourth time, the third or fourth person who's like just said what the Christian position is, right? But that's not how we use the word evil in most circumstances. So you haven't actually done anything by way of
No,
proving my
but
contradiction.
look, but you already noted that there's a distinction between those things being evil in the instrumental sense, right? And those
Yeah,
things being evil in the categorical sense. I'm saying
yeah.
that in this
What
case,
is the what's the
I'm
contradiction again?
sorry, I'm not done speaking. I'm saying that in this case, instrumentally speaking, since they're conducive to God's desires, God's ends, it's not the case that that action ought not to occur. And if it's
Yeah,
the
that's not
case that that
controversial.
action not ought to occur, then it's not evil.
Yeah, and that so with respect to God's decreed of will, there is nothing that is evil. If by evil you're saying that they are out of accord to God's decreed of will, there's nothing that's evil in that circumstance. But that's
Right,
not
and that's
controversial.
your
That's not
position.
complicated.
Your
No,
position.
it's not.
You
That's not
don't.
my position. That's not my position.
You said earlier that you take it that there's not going to be anything, right, which isn't going to be, let's say, all things considered evil, right, categorically speaking, because the
Yeah, but
Christian.
there's no evil with respect to God's ultimate decreed of will.
Yeah, you said earlier that the Christian position is that those certain things are not going to be all things considered evil, right? Because these things in question are conditionalized to God's desires and God's ends, right? And I'm saying if you're applying that view and anything that occurs is what's conducive to God's desires, and anything that occurs that's conducive to God's desires is moral, right? Then anything that's
No,
conducive to
that's not.
God's
No. That's not
desires.
what I said. No. So now you just like completely misrepresented what I said, right? So now you've now took the route of just you know taking different steps to the goal that we're not actually conceding to. So I didn't say that everything that happens in the world is in accordance with God's prescriptive will. That's not what I said. I said that they're in accordance with God's decretive will, and so far as they are in accordance with God's decretive will, they're
But
good if that's what you take it to mean. Okay.
you just admitted that he morally permits them under his decretive will. And I'm saying that if he
Yeah,
morally
God is
permits them.
moral. God is moral in the act of permitting them and in enacting His sovereignty and sustaining the
Yeah,
world in the midst of that
I
evil. God is
understand, but
moral in that
that's not
action.
even relevant, right? I'm saying that
So that's what I meant when I said God is
if
morally
you
permitting them.
think
So it is
if you
relevant.
think that he morally permits those things to occur, then it's not the case that the things in question that he's morally permitting ought not to occur. So they're not evil under that context.
They ought not. No. Well, it's not true that they ought not. It's not true that they ought not occur with respect to one context, not the other context.
Yeah, but
Okay.
why are you
By
bringing in the other
when I
context?
told you
That's the only context that matters.
when I told you that God is morally permitting actions, I said that God is, well, at least um, what I was telling you was that God is moral in His action of enacting or exercising His sovereignty and omnipotence. That's what I meant when I say that God is morally permitting them. I say that He's acting in a morally
Yeah, but I don't care about
like
God's
just fashion.
actions. I'm saying that
Well,
in
that's what
this
you told me. You said
context,
that God is
I'm
morally
saying in
permitting
this
them. So that's what I was
context, no,
saying.
I'm saying if he, no, look, I'm saying that if he morally permits X, right, then you're basically admitting under that context from his decretive will that X ought to occur, right, given that's morally permissible by God.
In His decretive will, it X ought to
Yes,
occur. That
yes.
have I ever said that? Have I ever said that that's not true?
Yes. So I mean,
When
then
did I
you
say
would
that was not true?
agree.
Wait,
Okay,
when did I
so
say that
then
was
you
not
would
true?
agree. Then you would agree that in that context, that thing isn't evil, right? Because
When did I
it's
say that
not the
was not
case
true?
that it isn't morally impermissible.
Okay, when did I say that wasn't true? When have I ever said that?
Well, you keep
When
saying
has that ever
that's
been my
not true,
position?
but you're not addressing what I'm saying.
No,
I'm
I said
saying
when have I? So I mean, you keep bringing these. This is about the half dozenth time you brought this up, and so this is some controversial fact of the matter when it's not. I'm asking you, when have I
it is a
ever implied that that's
controversial
not true?
fact of the matter because you're saying
Okay,
that
okay, well, when have I? So
thing,
that's not
that
an answer to my question.
action,
When have
you're
I
saying,
ever said that's not
sorry,
true?
sorry, I wasn't done talking. You're saying that that thing in question is morally permissible, but it's still evil, right? And that denotes a contradiction.
Does this
So
context
evil
does this
refers to.
context thing that we're talking about amount to anything other than a hypothetical norm? Because if so, then there's just an equivocation going on.
Yeah, Garth,
No,
can I
it
ask you a
doesn't.
clarifying question, please?
Sure.
Are you saying that the mere possibility of, like, the allowing the mere possibility of something is cognitively synonymous with that possible thing actually being done?
Well,
Wait, this
if
is just getting in the way. What is this? What's the context?
Is it? Yeah.
Well,
Does it amount to something more than a hypothetical norm? Because
it's
if it's just
a hypothetical norm, it's conditional
well then,
God's desire.
well, yeah. Well, if it's a hypothetical norm, then it's just not a categorical norm, and if it's not a categorical norm, then it's an equivocation on what a moral norm is. So you're just changing the subject.
If Jay agrees that evil is what ought not to happen in respect to God's morally permissive will, then it's relevant.
Evil refers to things that ought not happen with reference to God's prescriptive will. That's my position.
Categorically,
That's always been my position.
categorically ought not happen.
If by categorically you're saying that there's no scenario in which that ought not happen, then no, I'm not saying there's no scenario in which things ought not happen or that ought not happen.
Yeah, categorically means ought not happen, full stop.
All
Irrespective of any
yeah.
conditions, right? It's just a moral wrong. It just should not be done. That's it. That's the concept.
Yeah, my
Now, if,
position is that it's not that there's nothing that for example, when we're talking about rebellion against God, that should not happen with respect to anything. That's not my position.
yeah, so where evil is understood as something that categorically ought not happen, then you just think there is no evil.
No, evil refers to things that are out of accord with God's prescriptive will.
Yeah, but again, you're just redefining. Look, I can redefine evil as anything I want. Like I can redefine evil as walking down the street, right?
I'm
You're
not
just
redefining
changing.
anything. That's how evil is conceptualized as in the Christian worldview. I'm not redefining anything.
Yeah, that's just not a normative conception.
No, it can be normative. It's just normative. It's just not normative in the way that you're trying to posit it.
Yeah, it's some sort of relativistic kind of norm, which is
It's not
weird.
relativistic. God is the source of all truth. So it's
I
not
don't
relative to
understand how it's
anything
not.
that we.
What are you talking about when you bring up context besides saying relative to this context, X ought or ought not happen?
They ought to happen with respect to God's permissive will.
Yeah,
They
Not
relative
permissive
to
will,
the
happen
with
to
will.
respect to
they
God's
ought to
prescriptive will, and they
happen,
ought not
but look,
happen with respect to God's
you're saying
prescriptive will.
you're saying that they ought to happen, but conditionalized to God's desires, right? You're not saying that's independent. You're not saying that
There's nothing
there's
independent of
any
God's
ought.
desires or
So
God's mind. There's nothing independent of God's mind
right, so they're
or
they're
desires.
they're stance dependent, right? They're dependent upon God's stance.
Everything is.
Oh, okay, so there you go. You believe in
So where's the
stance
contradiction?
dependent ethics.
So what's the contradiction?
Well, again, just if evil is understood as categorically something that ought not occur, then you're just
No,
saying there is
I
no
want to get the
evil.
question. I want to get so either Altoid or now that Mads Beer is talking. What's the contradiction within my position?
There's no contradiction if you think there's no evil categorically understood.
Oh no, I want to get an answer from either of the two that were talking to me
Well, that's
previously. What's the
actually
contradiction within
correct.
my position?
No, that's actually, if you admit that from your position that there's nothing that's categorically evil, then there's no contradiction.
Okay, good. Altoid, so is there any contradiction within my position that you can argue for?
Problem of evil ain't a problem if there's
No?
no
Okay,
evil.
good. Thank
J.
you.
Robin is
Thank you all
denying
for
that
your time.
evil exists.
Thank you all for your
He's
time.
denying that evil in the categorical sense, which I'm just going to take
Wait, let
as
Jack go.
It's the only sense that's relevant to the discussion. He's just admitting that there's no evil.
J.
As
Robin is
classically,
saying that there's no evil.
Yeah,
as
all things work to the
classically,
good.
That's not what I'm saying.
as conventionally defined, yeah, there is no evil.
He's just said he's not saying that, so he's just contradicting himself.
No,
No,
he's
because evil
redefining
occurs.
evil to
I'm
be,
not
yeah,
defining
he's
evil to be
redefining
anything.
evil in a relativistic way, right? He's relativizing it to whatever context he's talking about. I mean, there's nothing to stop anyone from redefining evil as chess norms or redefining evil as walking down the street norms or anything else, right? But that's ultimately what he's doing. He's just using a proprietary notion of evil that's relativized. So it's
This isn't
basically just a
proprietary.
relativistic
It's what
view.
the Christian worldview holds
No,
to.
that's not what he's doing, Josh.
Yeah. So it's not. Yeah, it's not
Wait,
proprietary. It's
so
what the Christian worldview holds
he
to.
thinks that
Right.
so he
So
thinks that evil is categorical, John?
No, he's saying that categorically. For instance, things that happen are good in a sense that all things work to the good, and so when God judges evil, we don't call it God judging good, we call it God judging evil, and that action of judgment is good, and so the things ought to occur is what J. Robin is trying to say.
No, but that's not an answer to my question. Is he, because Josh's claim, which you denied, was that J. Robin was not talking about good and evil as categorical, right?
No, what
So
he
you're saying
said, what I objected to, what Josh was saying, is that J. Robin is defining it through proprietary definitions to be relative. That's what he said. That's what I said. J. Robin is not doing. J. Robin is not arguing for relative morality.
he's not arguing for relative morality. So you're
Oh
That's
my!
saying
correct.
that.
Let's
So you're saying it's
redefine moral
categorical.
relativism as, like, I don't know, chair norms. Or if you're a moral relativist, you do believe that there are going to be stance-dependent moral facts, John.
Of course, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. And what do you think when Jay Robbins said earlier that everything is in accordance with, I mean, God's stances, right? He's admitting that there's nothing that's independent of those stances. There's no stance-independent morals from his perspective.
Does he agree that objective is defined as stance independent?
Do
It
you
doesn't
not
really
know that?
matter what the definition is, right?
No, if
Um,
it is the case that he agrees that objective morals is stance independent and that stance is grounded upon God, then yes, there's a contradiction. But if he does not agree that objective represents stance independent, then it's not necessarily contradictory as far as J. Robbins can.
dispute is not a semantic one.
Of course, it's about semantics. How else do you derive
No,
contradiction
we're
Oh,
not.
unless
We're not
it's
left.
interested.
Jay Dodgen left.
I mean, I could discuss my. I
I
think
mean,
J. Robin
shut up,
made a mistake.
shut up,
I do agree with
shut up,
Altoid.
No, that's all
shut
right.
up,
We're not
shut up.
interested.
Do you know what he admitted, Jack, earlier? I got him to admit from his point of view that there's nothing that is, all things considered, evil.
Yeah, I mean, I do understand what he's saying. He could have worded it
It's all right.
better,
Nobody
but
cares.
Things considered, all things considered, pro toto like evil and pro toto good.
Oh, well, it's not my
Do you
position. Yeah,
understand
it's
what
not
that
my position.
means?
Yeah, well, it's not my position that there's any evil with respect to all things considered, because there's nothing that is happening in the world that ought not be done with respect to God's decretive will. No, there's not. There's nothing that's happening in the world that is out of accord with that. So if that's how you're defining evil, then I don't believe that exists. That's not the Christian position
Okay,
either.
so you're saying that pro toto, God's decretive will ought to occur, right?
Yeah, yeah. That's what I've told you this whole time. That's been my position.
Yeah, right.
That will remain
And
my position.
so, for anything that has most reason for occurring, Y, such that X is necessary for Y, then X ought to occur, right?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so if Y has most reason for occurring, and X is necessary for Y, then X ought to occur, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so God allowing evil leads to the best possible world, and it's necessary for the best possible world, and God ought to create the best possible world, and so evil is good, right?
No.
No, that's
Evil
not
is
what evil.
that which
Evil
ought
is
to
not
occur.
defined. Evil in the Christian worldview is not defined in the way you're defining it.
Oh, so it's not normative now.
But is it in the context that
If by
evil is
normative,
good for God's plan?
if you're just defining normative in this in the very narrow scope of things that all things considered or quote unquote pro toto should not happen, then no, there's no evil. But that's not how the Christian worldview normally defines evil. So, but if that's how you're defining evil, then yeah, there's no evil.
Well, I mean, I take it that it can't be the case that something both ought to and ought not to occur at the same time.
There are different senses in which they ought and ought not occur. A contradiction is something that is P and not P at the same time in the same sense. So it's not true in the same sense that X ought and ought not occur. That's not true within the Christian worldview.
Wait, no, but yeah, let's just take an example, right? The baby vaccine example. So it can't be the case that you ought to, and you also ought not to, give the baby a vaccine if it's going to save its life. In the same sense, right? That it
Yeah,
is both the
I
case
know.
that you should do something, and it is also the case that you should not do something.
Yeah, if you're talking
Why is it that you
the
should
word
not
ought in the
do
same
something?
sense, if you're using ought in the same sense, I agree with you, but that's not relevant to the position I hold to, because I don't believe that something ought not occur in the same sense. The sense you're talking about is all things considered ought not happen. I don't believe that anything all things considered ought not happen. So it's not my position that I hold to a contradiction.
Yeah,
It's not that difficult.
but
Everything
for
that
the
ought to
agent,
Yeah,
if
like
occur,
you
this is
use
not
that approach,
hard.
occurs on
This is not rocket science. Like, why is it so hard for you to understand? And everyone else can understand it. Literally, you've been in the room with I think everyone else I've talked to that's part of like your gang, and everyone else has to admit that I don't have a contradictory position, but you're still like
It
clinging
just
to it
seems
like for
like you're
dear life.
denying that
Like it's
evil
embarrassing for you.
exists, J. Robin.
No, that's not. But like that's not. No, I don't
yeah,
deny
I
that
mean,
evil exists. If you're defining evil
Billy,
within
talking
within the
prototype.
I'm just gonna
Yeah,
talk to Billy for a second. So, Billy, you understand what I'm saying, right? Where it can't be the
Yeah.
case that it is both true that you ought to do X, and it is also true that you ought not to do X. I mean, you can have reason for doing X and reason for not doing X, but to say that it is simultaneously the case that you ought to do X, and it's also simultaneously the case that you ought not to do X.
Now you
That's
said
just a
do
contradiction, right?
earlier. It was
That's just
occur.
Well, I'm asking
straightforwardly.
Why is
Billy.
it that you change the language to do now?
I'm
That's
asking
just
Billy.
that's just straightforwardly a contradiction. And so it's either the case that
Right.
that an action ought to be done or an action ought not to be done when we look at the grand scope, like pro toto, what ought to happen. And so you can't say that it ought to happen and ought not to happen. That would just straightforwardly be a contradiction.
Yeah,
I mean,
it would be like saying that good is that which ought to occur, evil is that which ought not to occur, and then good is evil, right?
yeah, I mean,
I don't believe good is evil though. So
I'm
nice try, but
unclear
that was a
about
fail. That was a fail.
I'm
Nice try
unclear
though.
about J.
Yeah,
Robbins'
thanks,
just
J. Robin. That
morality in
was very
general.
informative.
I'm unclear about J. Robbins' morality, like moral system in general, because I was trying to get clear on it before. We had a good chat. Like I said, J. Robin and I have been getting along, so I don't want to be mean. But J. Robin, when I was trying to ask you this before, when someone comes up to a random person in the street and shoots them in the face, would you say that that's evil? That ought not occur?
I would
Evil
say
and
that it
defined as a
ought not be
Christian.
done, but it ought
Yeah,
to occur.
John,
yeah, in the
why are
Christian
you?
worldview. In the Christian worldview, murder is wrong.
Well, murder bakes into the definition that it's unjustified. I'm talking about
Murder is
just if I
defined as killing, All right, that you don't have the right to do in the Christian worldview. You
I
don't have the
know,
right to kill
but
someone. And
look,
so
I didn't say murder because murder bakes into the definition that it's wrong. But I'm just saying, I walk up to a random person in the street and I shoot them in the face. You would say that's evil, right? That ought not be done.
that's
I ought
considered
not
murder in
do
the
that,
Christian. That's considered murder in the Christian worldview.
right? And that's evil, right? It ought not to be
How
done.
wait, how are you defining evil?
Ought not be done. I take that to be
With respect,
sort of a semantic primitive.
ought not to be done. You talking about like quote unquote pro total evils? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not. So yeah, that's not how Christianity defines evil. But if that's how you're defining evil, then yeah, that's not evil.
Oh
But
wait,
I
so
just
if I
don't get
walk
like
up to someone in the
what
face, wait,
Christianity
just
is
one
like
sec, wait,
defining
can
evil
I
as.
just
Well, if
wait,
it is
I
normative, if it is in all
wait,
things
I just want to.
considered, then I think he's gonna have to say that something could both be the case that it ought to and ought not to occur. Like, do you
I
see
think
Wait,
the
but
issue with
I'm
that,
evil
just
Billy?
trying to get. I'm
isn't
just
real
trying to
quick.
get
Isn't evil
clear.
and a possibility in the context of God's plan because you would be going against God's plan, but God always controls the plan, so it's impossible to commit evil with respect to His plan.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean, this
I'm
is
just
like
trying to
Well,
get
basic.
like
clear on
Thank you,
Jay
if it
Booney. Thank you
isn't
Robbins'
very,
pro
thank you,
toto,
Booney.
then
Thank
I
you very
just don't
much. Thank you
understand.
very much, Booney. I think you're now what the dozenth person that can understand this basic concept. Thank you very much,
Exactly. It's simple.
Booney.
I'm just trying to.
To me,
I'm not sure he's
the
agreeing with
clarification is
you.
this, okay? When you say ought not be done, right, and then you say ought not occur, well, everything that occurs ought to occur. Everything that occurs ought to occur, and it's good for God to let it occur. However, when it comes to ought not be done, right, murder ought not be done. Does that mean that ought not be done by God? God is not murdering, okay? God is ought to
Jay
occur,
Robin,
let it occur. And so, when when you understand the distinction, things that ought not be done ought to occur. There's no contradiction here.
Jay Robin, someone's offered to moderate a discussion with us too.
No, I don't need
Would
to
you
do
like
that.
to do that?
No, I don't. No, no, thank you.
Oh, okay. So are you sure? Like it's
I'm
just
talking
that
to you
there's
right
a
now,
lot of
Billy.
people here.
Billy, I'm talking to you right now.
Okay, sure. Okay, well that's fine. I'm just trying to get clear on your system. So just can I get like a straightforward yes or no? If I walk up to someone in the street and shoot them in the face, is that evil?
Yeah, if you're doing it for no reason, no justified reason, yeah.
Okay, sure. Great.
Well, wait, hold on. Wait.
If I
Let me just make sure I clearly understand your question, right? Because you and
sure.
I have very different definitions of evil. So this is like again like potential dishonesty that's occurring. When you say evil, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I'm saying all things considered, it
Okay,
ought
no,
not
then
occur.
yeah, no. So like, I know everything's within God's decretive will. So no, it's not evil with respect to God's decretive will. No,
Okay. But look, I'm just saying in
I gave you an
isolation,
answer.
right?
No,
Like,
I gave you an answer. No, it's not. If you're
wait,
defining
so just
evil
to
as
be clear, if
violations
I
of God's
walk,
decretive will, then
wait,
no.
sure, just to be clear, are you saying that if I walk down the street and shoot someone in the face, that's not evil?
You see the dishonesty? Does everyone notice the dishonesty here? Because we have different
Wait,
definitions
why
of
can't you just
evil.
answer the question?
And I already did answer the question. I told him
You
no.
said it was evil, and and
No,
and then
but then I had a
changed
clip.
it to
Then I
saying
wanted
it
to
wasn't
clear.
evil.
Yeah, because again, I'm really it's gonna drive me crazy. Okay, talking to you. Okay, again, we have different definitions of evil. I made that clear a dozen times. Okay, so that's why I asked you what your definition of evil was, because we obviously have different
Yeah,
definitions of
and I
evil,
gave it to
and
you.
you're capitalizing on that for the sake of trying to like win
Look,
points or whatever,
I'm
right?
saying all
It's
things.
dishonest.
I'm saying
Now it's now it's
evil is
now
all
it's
things.
blatantly dishonest. Now this is blatant
I'm saying
dishonesty.
evil is. I'm saying evil is all things considered, that which ought not to be done.
Yeah, no,
Um,
everything that happens ought to be done with respect to God's decretive will.
okay, right. And so by that definition, me walking down the street shooting someone in the face is good. It's not evil.
Yeah, but that's like good according to how you're defining good, but not good according to the Christian worldview. No.
But no matter,
Okay, so look,
Billy,
just
no
one.
matter what you do, it's good to God's plan because He's already planned it
Right,
out.
exactly. So if that's how you're defining good, just
I'm
according to
just
God's
trying to.
plan, then sure.
Ow. I'm just trying to get clear. Um, so what do you mean when you say evil?
Oh, thank you. For the first time, we're getting a good honest question here. Okay, we're talking about evil. We're talking about things that are outside of God's prescriptive norms that God has revealed to us uh, in special revelation through our conscience, right? Things like idolatry, things like murder, things like hating your brother, as Jesus Christ says in the gospel, is considered murder. Things like lying, stealing, those kind of things are considered evil in the Christian worldview. So it's things that are
Okay,
out of
so
accord with God's prescriptive standard of
All right.
morality.
evil is
So
just
I'm
that
just
which the
gonna.
Bible says you shouldn't do, right? It's analytically identical.
It's things that are outside of God's prescriptive moral standard he has revealed it to us, right? But yeah, these are things that are evil.
I'm just unclear where the normativity comes in.
Yeah, it's still unclear. So, uh, evil according to J. Robin is just that which God says you shouldn't do. So evil is just analytically identical to God saying, don't do this thing. Like those things, those are evil, right? So then the issue is just that it's not normative because you can run an open question argument and ask meaningfully whether those things ought to or ought not to occur. And if that's the case, then it's just like in the way that you're using it, it's meaningless.
Johnny, can you bring up Val? He's got his hand raised. He wants to come up.
Yeah, I don't understand why it would be meaningless.
Or
If there's a
John.
standard and a violation of that standard is evil, why would that be meaningless?
Well, it's not meaningless. It's the sense that we're unclear about where the normativity comes in.
Well,
Because
yeah.
if
So
you're doing,
in the case that you
Doesn't
say
okay,
standard already
in the
imply
case that you say
normativity?
just
the violation
just
is
one sec,
evil, you're just
because
saying the violation is the violation. But the
No.
question can still be
we
asked,
need a.
ought you to not violate that standard? That question can still be asked. And if the question can still be asked because it's not identical to the terms, um, then it's just not normative.
I mean,
I mean, we've
the
hashed this
word
out a million
standard
times.
already implies normativity, does it not? Where so you're asking where do you get the normativity when J. Robin invokes standard? That's the normativity there. I mean, I don't understand why you guys are so perplexed by that.
I mean, like chess rules are standards, and they're odds within chess, right? As if you're going to act in accordance with the rules of chess, you ought not cheat. For example, in chess, you ought not move a pawn 3 spaces forward, right? That's something you ought not do within the rules of chess, in the scope of chess.
J.
It's a
Robbins.
weird form of relativism, but even on this account, it's hard to sort of understand because, well, I think that there are two problems. One, anybody who believes this, I think that it's ultimately going to make action paralysis because it doesn't matter what you do, anything you do, in fact, turns out to be something that ought to have been done. So it sounds like there's just ultimately going to be this equivocation between descriptions and prescriptions. And so
I
that
think
just
it.
means
Yeah.
that, sorry, hold on, let me just finish my sentence.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. So what I was saying is then it doesn't make sense for one to weigh options or to make choices on this view because nothing counts in favor, all things considered, for what you ought to do over anything else, at least in terms of your mind. And so whatever you do is just what ought to be done. So I think it makes um, it ends up being that you can't make rational choices. You can't make any choices. In fact, you
We're
just
not
end
held
up
morally accountable.
behaving.
We're not held
And
morally
then,
accountable for our coherence to the decreed of will in Christianity.
the second problem with this is that it seems to entail that God is irrational because it doesn't follow then that it makes sense to make any prescriptions if you know what's going to happen and you know that someone is not going to do that. And in fact, if you know they're not going to do it, it follows that they shouldn't, in fact, do that. It doesn't make any sense to command that they do that. It doesn't make sense to prescribe anything on that view because you're saying something like you should do what you shouldn't do. So that just ends up being a contradiction.
what you
No, a
shouldn't
contradiction
do
is
ought to
something.
occur. There's a difference.
Yeah, I mean, we're just using the word should in different senses again.
Well,
So it's
so
not a
I'm
contradiction.
not understanding in what sense is it a prescription if you're not demanding that they do the thing that you're demanding.
That's what I'm saying. It is a prescription, but whether it ought to occur or not, it ought to occur if it's the case that he's doing what he shouldn't do.
Yeah, see, when I utter a prescription, the way I understand prescriptions is that it's an imperative, and it's imperative such that someone ought to do what I'm demanding them to do. Now,
That's
if you don't
correct.
believe, sorry, just real quick. Now, if you don't believe that they're going to do it, and in fact, in virtue of the fact that they're not going to do it, it follows that it's not the case that they ought to do it. Then you're saying that they ought to do something that they ought not to do. And so you just end up being around.
No.
No, because there's
What they
different
ought
senses.
not do ought to occur, right? They're not the same thing. And so if it is the case that they do what ought not be done, which is evil, and God ought to let it occur, then it is such the case that for purposes of mercy, which is good, for purposes of justice, if he judges the person, that would be also good, and for either way, it ought to occur.
I don't understand how that addresses what I'm saying, right? What I'm saying is when you utter an imperative, to do so rationally is to say, this is what ought be done. It's to demand someone. When you tell someone, say, you shouldn't do that, it means you have all things considered reasons not to do that, right?
I mean, we at least in my tradition, is such the case that God commands us to do things that we cannot possibly do, such as be holy as I am holy. Now that particular stand of God, God being the standard, right, is a reflection of His holiness and His perfection, right? And so when we fall short of that, it is when He gave us the law. It is not by obedience to the law that we're justified, right? Well, that's what many people think. No, it's so that we're conscious of our sin, right? That we fall short. This is what the law is for. And so if you're thinking that the law is there so that because we ought to do it, that's not how it's understood. It's so that we know that we fall short.
I don't understand how that responded to anything.
Because once again, Romans 3:20, I believe. We're not justified by the obedience of the law, right? So if it's the case that you think that the law was given so that we're somehow justified by the works of the law, we are not, right? It is a violation of the law that the wages of sin is death. And once again, the law is there specifically, explicitly so that we are conscious of our sin. Now, when it is such a case that you view it normatively, we ought not violate the laws that God has commanded us, right? And so when we do, we ought not do it. However, from God's purview, that whether He allows it to happen by letting you sin, whether He strikes you dead, preventing you from sinning, or whether He changes your heart so that you do not wish to disobey God. Well, in any case, all of those things ought to occur because God is in control of everything that occurs, and therefore they ought to occur, which is different than whether the agent ought to do a disobedience. So when God judges you, He judges you not for good, right? He judges you for evil, right? Because God is a just God, and He does not call evil good and evil and good evil. And so the actions that you do, which you ought not do, right? God justly judges you for those actions. And it is good that God judges you. And it ought to occur because then it gives God the opportunity to either grant you mercy or justice.
So again, I don't really understand how that's addressing anything I said. So I'm just going to ask you to recapitulate my argument so that I understand how you're addressing my argument.
Because what you're saying is, in one sense, you're saying that it's ought not be done, and good is what ought to be done, and evil is that which ought not be done. And so you're saying there's a contradiction there, in the
No, that's
sense
not
that
what I'm
God,
saying.
for you're not saying that's a contradiction.
No, I'm
Then
saying
what is the contradiction if that's not the contradiction? I thought I clearly
I'm
just said
saying
that's a
that
contradiction.
I'm saying that it's irrational for someone to prescribe something that they believe ought not be done, all things considered. And so I'm saying if God is perfectly rational, he doesn't prescribe all things what people have all things considered reasons not to um, not to do. And then what J. Robin is saying is God does prescribe things that beings have all things considered reasons not to do. And it follows from that God is rational, and it's not the case that God is rational. So those three premises produce the contradiction that God is not rational.
God
Sorry,
is not
the
rational,
contradiction that
but
God is not
where
rational and that God is
where's the
rational. That's the
irrationality?
contradiction.
Where's the irrationality and allowing, permitting, uh, allowing to occur
I'm not
that is not
talking about
rational?
whether or not there's rationality in permitting things or not, right? What I'm saying is when you made this distinction between a prescriptive will and and a decretive will, right? Which is things that you allow and things that you prescribe. I'm saying it's irrational to prescribe something that you believe should not be done, right? That's irrational. Just like it would be irrational for me to tell you, like, say I tell you not to kill somebody. I want you not to kill somebody. And I have most reason for you not to kill somebody. It's irrational for me to tell you to kill somebody if I think that my demand will be efficacious at all, if I think that this prescription is going to cause you to perceive the moral properties, the normative properties, and prompt you to act in accord with them, right, then it's irrational for me to prescribe something that's contrary to what ought to happen.
Okay, I heard you say something that I think I recognize as a problem. You said that it's irrational for God to tell someone to murder. Is this correct?
I don't
You do understand that God is not telling anyone to murder, right?
know. That's not what I'm saying. If he says, I'm not going to say murder because that's latent with normative language, right? But if God commands you to uh, not to kill somebody, if He says, "Do not kill this person," and He knows that you're going to kill that person, and in virtue of the fact that He knows that you're going to kill that person, that you ought to kill that person because it's consistent with His decretive will, right, then it follows that you ought to kill that person. And what's irrational is prescribing something to someone that it's not the case that they ought to do.
Yeah, once again, it is the case that he prescribes something and you ought not murder that person, right? But then just because the person ought not murder, right, does not necessitate that God ought not let it occur. He does let it occur, right? And it is good that he lets it occur. It is good that he lets evil occur, right? And there are reasons explicitly in Scripture why God permits evil to occur. There are several reasons. I could give you verse after verse after verse to tell you why God ought to let evil occur. You think there's a contradiction? There's not. It is good for God to let evil occur. There's no contradiction there.
It's irrational for him to prescribe something that ultimately ought not be done. That's irrational.
I'll give you an example. Okay, the government of the United States, or the state, for example, has murder. One ought not murder, right? But the government lets you murder, right? And when you murder, the government will prosecute you and perhaps execute you, right? So it is the case that the freedom that the government, because they don't tie you up, they give you the freedom. But if you abuse that freedom in a sense and you decide to use your freedom to murder someone, the government ought to let it occur in a sense of your freedom. And ought you do it? No, you ought not murder. and it's not that much different.
Well, the government doesn't know you're going to murder. That's what makes it disanalogous. And if they did know you were going to murder, and it, in fact would be good nonetheless if you did. Well, I don't know about murder. Let's just say illegal. I don't even know what this means. Let's just say kill some random guy, right? The government doesn't know that, and if they did know that, um, then it would be irrational for them to prescribe that you not kill that person, knowing that you're going to kill that person, and if in fact you killing that person is ultimately what ought to be done, right? That would be irrational for them to prescribe.
Yeah, the
Just like it's
government knows
irrational
that
for God, just like what I'm saying,
yeah,
it's irrational for God to prescribe that something on that someone doesn't do something. That's where I
right,
take it to be a prescription. Don't do this thing, right?
right,
I'm telling you not to do this thing. Now,
right.
if it's the case that God knows that they're going to do the thing that He's telling them not to do, and He in fact knows that. Even that when they do it, ultimately, it ought to be the case that they did it, right? Then it follows from that God is around.
The government knows that when they prescribe something, that people will murder. They know that. They don't know which individual, like God does in a sense, right?
Yeah, but
But in
that
the case
matters.
that
That
yeah,
makes a
yeah,
difference.
but here's the thing, right? God decrees. I mean, the government decrees that we have the freedom for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now,
But it doesn't decree that people get murdered,
within that
right?
freedom, right? There
It
are
doesn't decree that people get murdered, right? In fact, that doesn't even make
I
any
let you
sense.
speak. I let you speak, Val. Come on. And then, so, with respects to what the government decrees, they are permitting these agents, and they know people will violate the law. And when they do, so it's a little bit disanalogous. I agree with you in a sense that, with regards to God's decree rather than the government's decree, that God knows all things, that He's in control of all things, every little instance, right? But it's not much different in the sense that God, uh, for good reasons, right, allows these things to happen. Like I said, I can sit here and give you the exact reasons why God, it is good for God to allow evil.
I don't know what it means for God to allow evil, but I'm granting it for the sake of argument and making a further argument that God is simply irrational.
There are perfectly rational reasons why a good God permits evil. I mean,
If you
there
have, if
you're just saying that what a good God cannot possibly allow evil.
I'm
There's no
saying,
argument for that.
I'm
You want
saying,
to what? You're
I'm
going to
saying
side
for,
with what? Mackie or Epicurus or what? There is
I'm
no.
saying,
You're just arbitrarily saying that it's irrational. There's no argument for that.
yeah, the reason it's irrational is because you believe that it shouldn't be done, right? And so if you believe that it shouldn't be done, then uttering an imperative that it should be done or whatever, or vice versa, that's irrational to do because what you're attempting to do is attempting to prompt someone to act a way that you know that they're not going to act. And you're in fact saying that all things considered, given the way they're um, going to act, they in fact ought to act that way because you have all these reasons, then it would be irrational for you to prescribe them to not do those things. Just like it would be irrational for me if I were to say to you, hey, uh, go pick up that cup. And I know that you're not going to pick up that cup. And I know that in fact, all things considered, it's good for you not to go pick up that cup, knowing that in fact you're not going to pick up that cup. It's irrational for me to tell you to go to pick up that cup.
Here's the fundamental difference. I think that people may not understand, right? The prescription is not. Once again, we're not justified by the obedience of the law, right? So when God commands us to be holy as He is holy, it is rational for Him to command us to do something, to be something that we cannot possibly do. This is also in regards to the law, and therefore, because we fall short, because all have fallen short of the glory of God, it is perfectly rational that God sends His Son to be to come and to die in our place, right? And for God to be Savior. This is the plan from the entire time before the foundations of the world, and so it is perfectly within God's purview with His plan for evil to occur, and that we can't do anything about it except for, you know, be judged for the wages of sin is death, or be saved by the grace of God through faith. And so it's perfectly there's a definite reason why He allows it. If you think that He's prescribing something that so that you could obey the law, no, that's not why. That's not what Scripture says. That's what you suppose. And if it is the case that He prescribes something, so in the expectation that we obey the law, then you would be correct. But then you don't have the right idea of what the purpose of God
It's can I add something
prescribing.
real quick? From what I gather, can I reinterpret what you're saying, John? It's almost like God is putting these instigators, like these laws, as instigators to instigate somebody's behavior one way or the other. But He knows certain people will do one way and certain people will do the other. But He has to have those laws in order to instigate what His will, to instigate people to act according to His will.
I didn't quite get that, but it seems kind of close to what I'm trying to say.
I
So
just
don't
don't
I don't know what
understand.
you mean by
yeah,
instigate people to do His will. I mean, I
kind
don't
of
really
I
propel
know.
just
them,
I
propel
just
them
don't
to act in His
understand
will.
how it's rational to command someone to do something that you believe shouldn't be done. Just explain how that's rational to me. Command someone to do something that you think should not be done.
No, no, no,
How does
no.
that make it?
He commands us to do that which must be done. Now, the question is whether we're able to do it or not. We are not able, right? But
I don't
He
know
is
what
able
must
because He's
means.
God.
I don't know what
So,
must means here. It sounds like just like a different term for.
no, no, it's not should. It's actually must.
I don't know what the difference is. If I say you must do this, I'm saying you should do this.
It's
I don't
just
know
a
what you mean.
stronger prescription. That's even worse
Yeah,
if you're saying it's
it
like a necessity, some kind of necessity. That's even
it's
worse
correct.
for your case.
Correct, and it's necessary because God, being perfect,
Can you
being
believe what he's
holy,
saying,
he can he
Josh?
can he cannot
But how
he
Can you
can
cannot
he
believe
have
that?
any
command
part of
something which
sin
is
around,
impossible? I
right?
don't get it.
And
It's not a
so
command then.
yeah, so in other words, if you have this somehow some paradigm of somehow God has these prescriptions and we obey them and we somehow maybe fail here or there, but just as long as we have a preponderance of these actions, it's all good. No, that's what I'm saying. Even if we're 99.999% in accordance with that, that 0.001% is going to lead us to eternal conscious torment, right? And so what God did is because He requires we must be holy as He is holy, but we cannot do it in and of ourselves. So He has provided a way
Yeah, that's
so that
irrational.
we can
That's borderline unintelligible.
be imputed the righteousness of Christ through faith, and that's the gospel. That's
Do you
how we
think it's
understand it.
do you
Its
think it's
gospel is
rational to command
unintelligible.
someone to do you think it's rational to command someone to do something that you think is impossible?
Sure. And the
Okay,
reason for
go
that
okay,
is
go
because this
make
is what's
sorry, or
required
just
of God.
just real quick. Since you said sure, go make me a square triangle. That was
Well,
rational for me
well,
to
well,
command
well,
that, right?
well. This is the thing. That square. I mean, it's a bad example because righteousness, right, through obedience of the law, right, perfect obedience of the law is not impossible like a square circle is.
It's impossible given the facts.
No, it's impossible being within our sin nature, but God has demonstrated by His Son. His Son had perfectly was in accordance with the law. He was without sin, and so Jesus Christ, in other words, uh, is not synonymous with the square circle because just because it's impossible for us with our sinful
But
nature does not
if it's in
mean
our
that it's
nature for it to
impossible
be
for God.
impossible,
I
then
don't
yes, it's
understand. Is it
impossible.
possible to do something that God do you think it's possible to do something that God knows you won't do, given that God knows you won't do it?
I
No, it
think it's
is
rational, real
possible.
quick,
Here's the
because He
thing. Here's
knows
the
that
thing.
it'll elicit certain behaviors from you when He
It
knows that
it
you know
is
you can't accomplish this. And
yeah.
then this is going to put you in a state of despair But if you keep the faith, then this is his true test to you, whether or not you're going to keep the faith in spite of all the despair you'll experience as a result of his impossible to achieve rules.
Here's the thing, Josh. It is impossible in and of ourselves, but it is possible with God because He has provided a way for it to be possible through Christ, through the imputation of Christ's righteousness, right? That we're imputed through faith. And so, in and of our own actions, yes, it is impossible.
No, what
But
I'm
God has
saying,
provided a way
no,
for it
I'm
to be
saying it's
possible.
impossible that God knows that you do X and you don't do X. That's impossible.
What I'm trying to say is, it is possible for us to have sinned and be righteous in the eyes of God,
Maybe you're
be
not
perfect.
tracking the objection if you're saying that. What I'm saying is impossible is that God knows that you'll do X and you don't do X. That's impossible. In fact, it's impossible for anybody to know that you're going to do X and you don't do X. That's contradictory.
You're gonna have to repeat that again.
It's impossible for God to know that you're going to do X and you don't do X.
That's right. He knows that you're going to do X.
Yeah, so it's impossible, given that God knows that you're going to do X, for you not to do X.
That's right. It's impossible for you not to do X,
Right,
especially
so
when
it's
He knows
irrational.
what you're gonna do.
Right,
So,
so it's irrational for you to prescribe something that you think is impossible. It doesn't even have content.
well, here's the thing. It's impossible with the proper context. It's impossible in and of your own actions, right?
No,
But
it's
it is
impossible whether
possible.
God. No,
It is, but
look,
hang
it's
on.
not
It is
possible whether.
possible.
Look, I just want to stop
Yeah,
you
but
before you keep
here's the thing.
making
Let me finish,
blunders.
okay?
No,
It
you're
is
making blunders, and I
impossible.
want to stop the blunders. It's
Yeah, let me tell
impossible.
you, okay? It is
No, I want to
impossible.
stop you before
Let
you're saying not. You
hang
already
on,
said what you
Josh. Can
said.
I finish, please?
The
Can I
context
finish?
doesn't matter. No, because you brought up.
Yeah, sorry about that. But it is impossible with God in and of His. I mean, it's
Joey, if
impossible
you
for
mute me
you to
again, I'm
do.
just gonna
Hang
fucking
on.
leave. I'm not.
Yeah, you take your choice. I mean, that's fine. It is impossible with in and of your own actions.
Game over. Game over. Lights out.
Yeah, that's fine.
You've just been completely obliterated publicly.
Shut up while I'm talking, right?
Caught, you've been folded like a chair caught with your pants down.
Will you fucking shut him up? I just want to